So just to kind of start things off, thanks everyone for joining us here today. I got myself and my colleague Rob here are going to kind of lead through a presentation that we have. Looking for it to be more interactive than anything. We got a few points we want to cover, some questions throughout, and want to be more kind of a just discussion amongst things here as we go through some of the different topics. Kind of looking through of how partnering with the right team and clients can help make a transaction successful. Can you give a little insight just to our team, how we can collaborate together, helping satisfy financial due diligence, quality of earnings, business valuation, other tax components, and really just kind of go through some of those objectives, how we can help through that. I'll let Rob kind of kick it through here, and we'll just start off with quick introductions.
Good morning, everyone, or I guess good afternoon, I should say. My name is Rob Voppel. I'm a manager in the Eide Bailly transaction advisory team, specializing more so on the sell side engagements, taking clients kind of through a full banking sale process typically.
And then I'm Matt Lamrick. I'm a senior manager here in our deal advisory group, primarily focusing on the quality of earnings space. I'm working both on the sell side and the buy side of those. We also do some other kind of procedures around working capital, helping with PEG negotiations, other true up post-closing support, but primarily focus our area of work in the quality of earnings, and then based here in our Fargo office. Excellent. So we'll just kind of start things off today, just really at the beginning, right? Kind of preparing for that initial M&A process, right? Because as you begin thinking through that, right, there's several different factors that go into it. When you're looking at the different companies, right, how large is the company? What's kind of the revenue profile? How different growth relates to that? What are the different competitive disadvantages that they have? A lot of different key components that can factor into how a transaction may be successful, and as well as what's going to drive the value that's there in that valuation that comes through, right? And we'll dive into that a little more later here in the presentation. But on top of that, just other market factors, right? Kind of what are the current economic and industry conditions? How's that going to impact or have a tailwind into the different transaction and space for what they're in? What other kind of dynamics are out there, available buyers, lists, and we'll definitely cover all that a little bit more in detail as we proceed here too. So preparing for that process, I think that's a very big thing, right? Is when you get into anything, and let alone just the M&A side too, is being on top of things from the start. So it's developing that transaction team, right? Having them in place from the very beginning. As much lead time as you can use to bring them under the fold, right? Whether it's the internal transaction team, right? If you're thinking of the company there, who's all going to be involved on that end, based on the size, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, kind of getting people into the loop right initially, identifying the goals, the areas, the timeline of things there. And then on the external side, right? Involving that outside counsel, right? Who's going to be there that's going to help lead through a lot of the legal issues, drafting agreements, assisting with all of that. How can a financial advisor help with a lot of that process? It's somewhere with a company that might need that help right away, where it is necessary to have a sell side quality of earnings, or where do you want to get people involved? If you can think of that ahead of time, have that plan, it just helps everything kind of smooth line it as you look to go to market later on through everything.
Thanks, Matt. I think the other side of preparing for the transaction is really a bigger focus on the business internally. As we look to take clients to market, one of the things that we talk the most about is making sure that your day job as managers, as operators of the business, is not distracted by the potential for a transaction. As a lot of you, I'm sure, know, having gone through this, the process can be rather long, and deal fatigue at some point inevitably sets in. But we need to make sure that the business itself continues to prosper, continues to be successful, because there's nothing worse than kind of getting to the 11th hour and then realizing that buyers have cold feet and want to walk away. And so, focusing and making sure that owners and operators are aware of this on the front end and continue to manage their time accordingly is really important. The other thing that we spend a lot of time discussing with management and with owners is who is going to be involved. As Matt mentioned, there's a plethora of people both internally and externally that can be involved in a transaction. And there's no right answer as to who should be involved, right? Being confidential and keeping things somewhat discreet is oftentimes a very important part of any transaction for a seller, and they may not be comfortable bringing 3 to 5 managers in at the front end and including them. On the flip side, some management teams are a lot more willing to be open and kind of transparent as they go through the process. And so I think having an open dialogue and conversations about what are the priorities? Is it confidentiality, or is it kind of spreading out the workload across your people? These are really important conversations that we want to have before ever beginning kind of the heavy work of preparing monthly financials or marketing to a broad set of buyers. And then I think we talk about this on the front end, but it becomes even more apparent as you work through a transaction is aligning kind of incentives and aligning motives with your top group of people to make sure that they're invested as much as the sellers are in seeing the success of the business post-close. Whether this is through transaction bonuses paid out at closing, or whether it's through incentive packages that are kind of vested over, say, 12 to 24 months post-close. This helps to kind of align our motives and align management with the next tier of management that will be continuing forward in the business. At this point, we'd like to try and have a little bit of dialogue or a little bit of an open peppering here. But as for those of you that have gone through a transaction in the past, at what point have you guys been engaged by your clients? The question really is trying to get at, we oftentimes get asked once a transaction is either already started, i.e. an LOI is in hand, or multiple buyers have come to the table and said, hey, we love your business, seller, we really would like to have a chance at buying this. And sellers may not even know that they're sellers at this point. So at what point do you guys typically get engaged or have someone contact you regarding a transaction? And I apologize, I can't see everybody while I'm sharing my screen, so I'm going to go off it for a second and see if anybody wants to throw out an answer.
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself or turn your camera on to do it, or if you want to throw in the chat too, that works great as well.
Yeah, I think we, Tyler Leverington here at Onstead Twitchell in Fargo, we see really a wide array, everything from people show up, call or email and say, hey, I've got a buyer, I'm selling, here's the key terms, we need someone to help us make it happen, to more recently, and I don't know if it's a coincidence or if it's people looking at inflation headwinds and changing interest rates and maybe some macroeconomic headwinds, but recently we've had a lot more companies coming to us saying we're starting to think about the future and transition, what a sale might look like. Where do we find a buyer and how do we start?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Tyler. And in your experience, what are kind of the pros and cons of being involved earlier versus kind of call it that post buyer identification or post letter of intent? I know for me personally, right, it's a delicate balance, right? We can probably add the most value as advisors if we're involved very early. And can help kind of prepare, as we've been talking about, and really get things set up for the best success and, quite frankly, the highest enterprise value. On the flip side of that, right, there's a great deal of legwork that goes into getting a company through all the preparation and then to market, and sometimes that doesn't always actually bear fruit, so to speak, and something happens. So what are, in your experience, kind of the pros and cons of being involved early versus later? What do you see as the best time?
Yeah, for clients that are cost sensitive, definitely a pro of being involved later is a lot of the legwork has been done already. But with that being said, I'm a lot more comfortable being involved much earlier. because so often there's things that clients don't realize are important or aren't thinking about. And when they come to me with, here's who the buyer is, here's what the terms are, they think it's going to be a quick, put this on paper, we'll sign it in 2 weeks and we're done. And in those instances, I think a lot of critical details are much more likely to get missed or overlooked, whether it's assigning contracts or, you know, figuring out how we're going to work with, whether it be key employees or key suppliers or other relationships. I think when you get involved really early, just by nature of the transaction, you're forced to work through so much more of that, and things are less likely to get missed.
Yeah, I would second that. I think, you know, in our experience, even if specifically from the legal side, maybe there's not a lot of involvement or a ton of time necessary, having that intro done on the front end so that there's at least an open line of communication and a certain level of comfort throwing some of these key terms to the legal team, to the advisors. We see that ends up paying dividends big time on the back end, where we're not having to negotiate kind of key terms or key language in a purchase agreement for the first time when we get the purchase agreement, right? We can kind of have that in the first turn as opposed to going back and forth maybe 8 or 9 times. Awesome. Is there anybody else that has opinions on early versus late, or when they're most likely to be involved?
This is Andrew Smith from the Vogel law firm over in Fargo, and everything Tyler said, I would say we're seeing a lot of the same stuff, and that was super helpful, Tyler. So I agree with you. The only comment I would really add is I think we see some challenges. I've seen a few lately. Others in my office have too, where people on the early stage come in on the sell side and say, you know, hey, I'm thinking about selling my business, and they don't have the first idea where to start, and they kind of look to legal counsel a little too much, in my view, to come up with deal terms on pricing, all of sort of those considerations. So I think that's been an issue as well.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I would say we have also, and I think this is where you know, Eide Bailly ends up getting involved a lot from legal referrals is when we have partners like, you know, Andrew, the situation you described, who's kind of say, hey, look, that's an economic term of the deal. That's not really what we're, you know, that's not our area of expertise and probably where we're best suited to spend a lot of time. Let's get an advisor, you know, even if it's an LOI stage, maybe an unsigned LOI, but there's an offer on the table where we feel like we can still add significant value, you know, negotiating the deal terms. And look, we've been in a number of situations where we've gotten to that point, and when we start to push back and you know, counter buyers to say, well, if I'm not getting an insane deal here, I'm not really willing to pay closer to market. That's fine, right? We have the ability then to kind of regroup, maybe get our ducks in a row a little bit more with you know, a marketing effort that's not just an unsolicited LOI, and then try again to get back out and get really what a more true market value is. Awesome. Thanks, guys, for kind of participating there. Let's we can flip forward here. Let me go back to sharing my screen.
I think even just while you're pulling it up, Rob, too, just to, you know, to Andrew's point too, I think that's something I know we've seen, and I think you have too, Rob, just in some deals, the kind of flip side of it as well, right? You know, where maybe we're getting involved on the front end of a transaction, and the buyer or the seller, you know, doesn't have a legal counsel lined up yet, right? So I think it kind of goes both ways too, where really identifying on that front end, you know, where does everyone kind of fit in that wheel? Because there is just a lot of moving parts in a transaction where everyone has their expertise, and finding those key advisors is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so you know, following from that, then, right, once you kind of dive into that area, right, you know, you get involved with management, with the company there, you know, there is a lot of prep work, like Rob said there. You know, how do you kind of get an understanding first off from the client? You know, is it a long-standing one that you know, and so you have that background of the business, or is it a newer one and you really need to get a better understanding? And as you work towards what that deal looks like, there's a lot of questions that need to be asked and answered to better understand. You know, is this just a single entity type business, or are they carving out, you know, one area of the operations, right? Kind of identifying with the company and management, you know, what's all going to be part of this deal. You know, from an operational perspective, right? You know, what's being sold, what are the services, kind of what's that secret sauce that's there that, you know, is going to be key to highlight, that's going to really drive that value. You know, historically, right, does the company run its financials on a, you know, accrual or GAAP basis, or is it very much so cash basis? Is there going to be a lot of work that needs to be done to get them on a more kind of historical accrual method that buyers are going to want to see? And then from there, how does that also transpire into, you know, forecasting the next few years out, right? You know, kind of proving those historical numbers that can be used to justify a lot of those assumptions and forecasts that drive that enterprise value that's there. So a lot of different questions and areas that you're going to want to look at, and that, you know, we look at when we go into a project to talk with owners and management about, because that is what's going to drive a lot of that value that's there. And so kind of leading into that on that last point, right, of the, you know, kind of financial piece, right? You know, you want to make sure that you have that clean house that's there. And when we say clean house, it's, you know, are those historical financials that you've been operating on, are they reliable? When we say reliable, right, are they in accordance with the accounting standards, or are there some deviations that need to be considered? You know, what's going to happen when a buyer comes in and looks at all that information? So one area that helps with a lot of that is the financial due diligence. And I think it's, you know, in the last few years, it's become a lot more prevalent, and what we've seen is being involved on that sell side, doing that kind of quality of earnings for the seller at the very front end. You know, because maybe they haven't had their financials audited or reviewed, or haven't, you know, maintained them. They're more on a cash basis historically, because that's all they've needed, that's how they've operated. But when you move to that transaction stage, there's going to be a lot of different metrics and ways that buyers are going to want to see it. So it's getting in on that front end and identifying, can a quality of earnings bring in that value to help with that? And not only do we bridge those to the accrual type financials, but, you know, we're also going to look, right, is there non-recurring adjustments? Is there things that have impacted expenses or revenues that just aren't going to no longer be the case? Or has a new business line been developed? You know, other R&D that's been undertaken that should be highlighted, that, you know, the seller is undertaken, that they want to get the value for. So the quality of earnings can really identify a lot of that information and highlight it in a report and quantify it, most importantly, to help drive those adjusted earnings that can be used for that enterprise value calculation. You know, getting involved in that front end really helps. You know, a buyer's always going to come in and do their diligence as well. But when you start on that sell side and having that done on the front end, not only are you getting out in front of things by identifying any key issues or risks that could occur when a buyer comes in, but you do kind of create a lot of that legwork and get it done with already. You know, a lot of those requests that a sell side quality of earnings is going to take are going to be what a buyer requests too. So you're going to have that all, you know, pulled together initially, and it's going to just help a little bit as you dive into buyer diligence to have not be as heavy of a lift during that time, and can streamline it there. I think that's one very key benefit from having a quality of earnings performed on the sell side, is that it does help streamline things as you go to market and work with buyers, not only from their own diligence perspective, but to hopefully not run into any, you know, key red flags or issues that are going to cause a retrade of the deal or cause something to blow up. It's to identify a lot of that ahead of time too. So now we'll come back to a couple more questions here too, and kind of thinking on that same theme. You know, when you think back to some of the deals that you've worked on previously, you know, what are some hurdles that you've experienced, you know, in a transaction, whether it's been on the front end, or maybe it's been, you know, after you got involved post LOI or through buyer diligence, that you ran into issues and you know, maybe could have been avoided by starting on the front end. I don't know if anyone has any examples or thoughts that they've had from there. Feel free to, again, kind of come on camera and chat, or toss anything in the chat as well.
Hey guys, I'll comment just from my side. I help on a lot of the financial diligence stuff, but it seems like, well, once a quarter or so, I'll get a call related to networking capital and helping define what networking capital is and help negotiate specifically networking capital on something we hadn't ever worked on before. And you're kind of really behind the 8 ball at that point. And whether they have had a quality of earnings on their side or haven't, if they've done a buy side or a sell side. Hopefully if they've done a sell side, it's covered, but most often it's when they haven't or they've elected not to. But it just makes for a kind of a mess of a situation where they're too late in the game to really define what deferred revenue is, for example. And I might be stealing some of these guys' thunder later, but that's where we run into the biggest snag on some of these projects. And I just feel like on the diligence side, especially as legal advisors, which many of you are, just helping define working capital and knowing that it's a significant part of kind of a closing transaction. I would just emphasize that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are good points there, Kyle. And I think even just thinking of that, right, when maybe you do get into that situation or get involved and it's time to get to networking capital, because I think that sometimes is a lost piece almost in a deal, right? Everyone's really focused on the earnings, the growth, a lot of the other kind of legal, HR, customer diligence, and then you get to the end and it's, oh, now we have networking capital. What are we going to do, right? We kind of just look at the 12 months, and if you're on the seller end and you're not as sophisticated or not gone through many transactions, you maybe just don't know ways that buyers can take advantage of that. And to Kyle's point, one big area that we see a lot is that deferred revenue or that customer deposits piece. Are they treated as debt-like items from a transaction purposes, or should they be included in networking capital? And ultimately, how does that impact, right, what a seller is going to receive in actual cash proceeds? I mean, there are a lot of big dollars behind that, and similarly, just with kind of networking capital PEG negotiations. So I think, as we like to get involved as soon as you can in that realm, because it's a lot of times easier to help identify trends or areas that we maybe want to focus on, whether the target should be developed off of a 12-month average, a shorter, a seasonal trend. It's a lot easier to do that on the front end versus coming in where something's much more developed and have to play defense. So I think just, in your situations, if you see or hear some of those key items for networking capital, I think there's a lot of value that can be driven there. And Rob, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, but I'm sure you guys see that a lot too as you go through your process as well.
No, without a doubt. And I think the thing I'd also reiterate is, regardless of whether it's you as an attorney kind of being involved on the front end and really handling a lot more of the what I'll call negotiations of the deal, or whether it's us, I think sharing information both ways and having parties involved. I mean, I had a deal recently that it nearly blew up, and thankfully the attorney we worked with was able to save it. But very late in the game, it was identified that the ability to transfer a contractor license due to the deal structure just was not feasible. And so we ended up having to push closing nearly 6 weeks while a bunch of people got new licenses, et cetera. And I think, it's diligence is not just the financial aspect of it, but it's the other aspects, whether it's HR, whether it's legal, that I think having the right parties who know and who that is their area of specialty involved really pays dividends. I mean, this was very much a item that could have been identified early on had the appropriate people been kind of where they needed to be, and probably would have saved a lot of heartburn and certainly would have saved 6 weeks of time while we waited for licensing to get figured out. So I think it's recognizing those pitfalls or those hurdles early on and being able to identify whether it's in working capital or whether it's a legal aspect or whether it's an HR and environmental aspect, right? Getting the necessary people involved. And I think most people on this call probably have enough deal experience to identify at a high level the issue that they're going to face. It's just a function of calling the right party at that point and getting them involved.
Yeah, I think another issue that I've run into a number of times is when you start talking about family-run companies that have been in the family for a couple of generations. So oftentimes it seems that there's books associated with multiple different businesses that are kind of the same business, but kind of separate businesses? And is that really what you're selling or not selling in this transaction? And how do we unwind those things? And from an accounting and valuation analysis standpoint, how do we separate those things? And what's appropriate to include and what's not based on what's actually being transferred and the buyer's expectations?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, without a doubt, the lifestyle business is very much, I think, what most of us are interacting with, and kind of unwinding the lifestyle from the business, right? Is always a key part of any transaction. If we flip back here.
Yeah, I know, just had a question coming as well, Rob. Kind of just asking, kind of how important it is having, a quarterback, right, for the transaction, kind of leading the deal. And with that said, do you find, they're typically on the buyer side, kind of the seller side? How does that impact, or on your end, Rob, doing some of them more? Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. I think if I compare deals where we've been involved or get a call, say post LOI, and there's already a single buyer at the table, there's still certainly value that can be added via doing the research on the market to see if we can squeeze a little bit more enterprise value. Certainly value to be added on working capital negotiations and just general terms of the deal, whether it's earn-out structure or cash at close or employment negotiations for people to stick around kind of on a consulting basis. There's still a lot of value to be added. With that said, right, having a quarterback from the get-go, I think, is where you really see the most value added, because between having relationships with a lot of equity groups, around the country, even the world, we are able to create a lot of competitive pressures, getting multiple interested parties at the table. And so we certainly see a lot more economic value via, enterprise or purchase price. But I think also it just generally allows us to get a better sense of what the market is calling for, and a more clear picture for sellers. And what I think that does at the end of the day, right, is it really just allows us to not feel like we left anything unchecked or any stone unturned, right? There's been instances where getting involved later in the game, you get closer to close, and a seller might say, do you think we left? Was there a chance we could have got something better? It's tough to say in that scenario, right? If you didn't really have the opportunity to go out and do a broad process, or at least kind of call some of the other very obvious, suitors that would make sense. And so I think, yeah, having someone quarterback that process from the start is definitely where we see a lot of value. But regardless, I think we see a ton of value in just having a trusted advisor be alongside, because let's be honest, for most business owners, right, selling their company is not really it's not their day job, and it's not their area of expertise. They're operators. That's what they're excellent at. And that's what brings an interested party to the table, in the first place. But, negotiating deal terms, economics, all of that is a little bit outside their area of expertise oftentimes. And that's not to say that private equity tries to take advantage of anybody, or any buyer for that matter tries to take advantage of anything. But, sometimes it is easier for them to do so if you don't have a trusted advisor sitting next to you.
Yeah, and even on top of that too, Rob, I think you hit well at the very end, is it's helpful having that advisor or that quarterback there, because it takes off extra time that would be incurred by that owner, by that operator, right? They're there to help lead that process, making sure everything's done timely manner, and they're the one kind of taking that authority or that responsibility. And I think that's one thing that ultimately helps with the deal too, is having that quarterback. Is it falls back, here's the person that's leading the deal. Some stuff just doesn't get lost into the weeds then, because you have someone that is responsible behind that also. Definitely helpful in everything there too, and great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess one additional thing that I failed to mention, the other thing is just time, right? Having somebody who's there helping you do some of the more monotonous tasks, whether it's answering simple questions or pulling information and putting it in usable formats to streamline the diligence process, all of that is a hindrance to an owner, to an operator running a successful business. And so being able to kind of take that burden and really act as an extra set of hands is huge for most business owners, and probably, quite frankly, while it seems maybe less important, one of the biggest reasons why we see a lot of people call us is because they just say, I can run the business, but I don't have the time to also answer all of these questions. I need someone who I can go and, basically spend a day downloading everything and kind of brain dumping to you, and then have you be my liaison or my quarterback. And so just from a sheer time perspective, it takes a huge burden off any seller. So as we kind of transition from a lot of pre-sale type of conversations around preparation and the interested parties and who is involved and all of that, kind of at a high level, all of that feeds into ultimately what a seller can expect to get for enterprise value, right? Certain industries obviously have higher valuation multiples and have more interest, I'll say. But that's, on the flip side of that too, there's a number of industries that we're seeing have strong interest from buyers because they just feel that they're untapped markets, or that they've been kind of ignored or neglected. One specifically, the construction industry, which has historically been less attractive just due to the somewhat cyclical and project-based nature. We're seeing a great deal of activity from private equity, especially as the general shift in private equity has gone from 5 to 7 year hold and sell periods to a lot more patient capital. We're hearing a lot more of the middle market type of firms come to us and say, hey, look, our hold period is no longer 5 to 7 years. It's maybe on the low end now 7 to 10, but for a lot of firms, even with multiple funds, they're able to transfer kind of from fund to fund, and they might look to hold for anywhere from 12 to 20 years in some cases. And so as we've seen that, we're seeing new opportunities for business owners open up in industries that I would say historically have not had as much institutional capital interest in. And so as we think about what goes into enterprise value, what really drives that value, most deals, with the exception of a few specialty industries, are still driven largely by EBITDA times an industry multiple. And what factors into EBITDA obviously is most of the things that Matt discussed, as far as having a clean house financially, right? So we need to have a strong understanding of what the numbers are saying and what the trends are, so that we can paint the appropriate picture. But there's other kind of more intangible aspects that also are very, very important from the business's side, probably most predominantly being management, right? Are the sellers interested in sticking around for a year, 2, maybe even 3 years to continue to see the business grow and see kind of more value be added? Or is this a scenario where they're really looking to exit entirely in a short period of time? And so a new management team is going to need to kind of come on, drink from the fire hose quickly and learn, and then be able to take over maybe in 12 months with no real input from former management. These are the types of considerations that ultimately are driving enterprise value.
Rob, on that point too, in your guys' process and the different deals you've been working on, how do you see, the differentiator there, like you just mentioned, of management, whether there's the team that's there that's ready to stick around, or if there's a new team needed? How do you guys see that when it comes to kind of impacting deal value?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. There are certainly buyers who say, hey, look, we have experience in both. We're happy to really see any of these. We just need to know. But what I would say is more common, especially for the middle market private equity type of funds or family offices, is them saying, look, we are providers of capital. That's what we do exceptionally well. We can help you grow because we can do that as well. But what we are not is we're not experts in operating and managing a pool builder, for instance, right? And so they prefer to see management who is going to A, roll equity, and B, stick around for, anywhere from probably 3 to 5 years at a minimum, I would say, to continue to see the business grow. If there is a really strong, second tier of management, which again, it plays heavily into kind of ultimately how high the multiple will go, but you'll see some groups say, okay, well, maybe 12 to 24 months is a good transition period. And then the next tier of people who are going to be incentivized with some sort of equity components will take over and can really propel the business forward. But, the holy grail, and I'm sure most of you guys, have experienced this, the holy grail is a nice growing, EBITDA business in an industry that's somewhat consistent and modelable with a great management team who wants to stick around and roll equity. Those are really the deals that private equity is salivating over, because they can take that, provide, relatively cheap capital to it and watch it double or triple in a short amount of time, which then opens up the opportunity for all people who will end up being equity holders, including the former owners who likely have rolled, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the deal to take a second exit and or, just continue to kind of see the business flourish and be positive cash flow.
Good points.
As we approach the market and kind of consider what buyers are going to see this, there's really a handful of options and how we go about it, right? A lot of times in our, already received an LOI type of scenarios, we're doing a unilateral negotiation. It's 1v1. We might already even be exclusive. Obviously, the benefits to this are it's a much shorter time to close. And quite frankly, if there's already one buyer at the table and the seller is interested enough to kind of entertain an offer, there's often already a level of comfort and a level of confidence in them as a partner, which is, I think, something that's very important that maybe doesn't always get the headlines that it is. But as we talk to sellers, it's really about finding the right partner. Enterprise value is always somewhat of a negotiation, as are all deal terms, but finding the right partner is really the key to any transaction being successful, because even if someone's willing to pay more and they're a terrible partner, that deal is normally going to fall apart at some point. So, the couple of benefits to the unilateral situation, obviously the con being we don't really have the competitive pressure of multiple parties at the table bidding against each other. The limited market approach, we've seen this a lot as of late, right? Where sellers say, look, maybe today is not the perfect day for me to go out. I'm still young enough that I want to stick around for a couple more years, but I recognize that in 3 to 5 years, I'll want to do this. Let's go find that perfect partner. Let's only approach the people that I, seller, really, really feel confident can get a deal done and I would be interested in partnering with. And then I will stick around for 3, 5, maybe even longer. It's really a function of taking some risk, some equity off the table for me. We've seen this, be a very, very common, probably the most common approach, quite frankly. Pros, we get some competitive pressure. The timeline is still relatively condensed compared to, say, a full auction or a full, market approach. And we, tend to get pretty good results. I would say the other pro is from a confidentiality perspective, we're not sending this to everyone. And so we can kind of keep the number of people who are in the know of a potential deal a lot smaller and a lot closer to the vest. The broad market approach and the auction are somewhat similar in nature, but it's basically, gives us the highest probability of finding some buyer. And oftentimes also gives us the highest enterprise value, as everyone is who feasibly could do the transaction is included. It tends to be a very long process, quite frankly. And one of the issues that we do find with the broad market approach is sellers kind of getting deal fatigue as we work through, what could be, instead of a 2 or 3 week seller, buyer negotiation process or interaction process, with this many parties involved, it's not uncommon for it to take a month and a half to kind of vet through all interested parties and decide who's going to ultimately get a shot at it. So again, pros, high value, obviously most likely to find any potential buyer. Cons is it's quite a bit bigger lift, both from a seller's perspective and from an advisor's perspective, quite frankly. As we think about the buyer sphere, again, another way to segment it is really between strategic buyers and financial buyers. We've seen a lot in both spaces, especially as, you know, growth has become a little bit more difficult organically, strategic buyers stepping up what they're willing to do in the M&A space. I think you oftentimes get what is a very logical alignment between sellers and buyers because there's a natural fit, whether it's industry or geography or whatever. And so that adds value. And I think there's also a certain level of understanding already of the business model that makes a transaction a little easier to consummate because you're not trying to educate somebody on an entirely new space. You know, obviously the biggest con or consideration that we discuss with sellers is, do we want to partner with these people, right? Culturally, do our businesses align? And then also, you know, is there any trade secrets that we risk getting out into the marketplace of a competitor in a lot of cases that could potentially come back to hurt us if the transaction doesn't ultimately go through. On the flip side of that, right, financial buyers, obviously liquidity not a problem. They come with a lot of capital and can oftentimes bring a new perspective and some additional insight into how to approach things. With that being said, right, they're not going to give you kind of the playbook on how to operate your business. So there's still a lot of involvement from sellers in kind of running the business post close. So a slightly different buyer profile, if you will, but you know, we see it in most transactions going to both strategic and financial buyers is when we get the best results, because certain industries are more conducive to financial versus strategic buyers wanting to enter the marketplace. And then the last option is going more, you know, what we consider the ESOP route, which is to sell to internal management. You know, there's unique hurdles associated with this. Primarily is the capital going to be available, but this is a very viable option we found specifically for industries or for businesses where maybe we do kind of a limited marketing approach and we don't get the results that we want or had hoped for. It's not to say that we can't find a way for that owner or that seller to transition and take some equity off the table. We just sometimes need to take an alternative route, and this is one of them that is very viable in a lot of cases. So, you know, take a pause here and kind of flip back to you guys. What are your experiences, pros, cons, or you know, war stories about strategic versus financial buyers? And do you guys see, you know, preferences from your sellers? Is there one group that or one industry that just says, hey, look, we just don't like financial buyers for whatever reason, that only strategics work? Or is it pretty broad? Maybe there's not a preference. Maybe people don't care, just get the deal done.
I could share a little bit. From my perspective, I enjoy working with both, but strategics just understand the business so well. They're so interested in understanding all of the details, but they aren't deal professionals, so they just take a lot of coaching from everybody, including, I'm sure, the attorneys in the room. Versus private equity groups, financial buyers, this is what they do. This is their profession. So it's just a lot more streamlined, but you know, just the expectations are a little bit different on how quick turnaround times are and things like that. So just a little contrast there to share.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kyle. Thank you. You know, anecdotally, I had a funny experience talking about them being really knowledgeable about their businesses that they're investing in from a strategic standpoint. I had a management presentation recently with a snow removal company, and the buyer and the seller, the two kind of head people, had an hour conversation about salt and what salt is best suited for what temperature and the coloring of salt. And it was like very overwhelming for me as a non-salt addict type of person to listen to an hour worth of conversation about salt. But to Kyle's point, right, I mean, these guys were geeking out about salt because that was their business and they knew it very, very, very well.
I guess I'd jump in and say that we see both a fair bit. And I don't know if there's necessarily a preference overall. I mean, to your point, Rob, from a minute ago, if you're selling and someone's willing to pay, a lot of times that's the biggest factor. And I would agree with Kyle that there's definitely, or with Kyle's point from a minute ago, there's definitely a big difference in terms of the knowledge of how to get a deal done versus the knowledge of the business. I think the consideration that I see mattering is whether somebody's willing to stick around in a transition services or in a employment agreement for a period of time, or whether they're not. So I would just throw that out. I think that makes a big difference. And then every once in a while, I guess you run into somebody who doesn't like, say, private equity, but not commonly for me, at least.
Yeah, there certainly was I would say it's starting to taper a little bit, but there certainly was a period of time 4 years ago, 5 years ago, where I think a lot of the industries that had not been already kind of taken over by private equity or invested in, there was a stigma associated with private equity, right? Which is these guys are going to come in, they're going to fire everybody, or they're going to strip down the business and like really make us run lean. Suddenly our controller is also going to have to clean toilets. And I think that attitude or that stigma is largely gone, but you're absolutely right, Andrew. I mean, we still do run in from time to time, people, sellers who are just like, I mean, I'll go strategic, but I just can't do private equity. Like, I won't let them come and take over my business, which is fine. I mean, we certainly will accommodate, but again, with eyes wide open, being, that may not reap the best result for a potential transaction.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head when you talked about them stripping down the company. The biggest concern that I hear when a buyer is not a strategic buyer, but is a financial buyer is, well, what's going to happen to my employees?
Yep, absolutely.
Are they going to come in and slash benefits? And are they, what's going to happen to my employees is probably the biggest concern I hear when that discussion is happening.
No, that's a great point, Tyler. And I would agree. Employee treatment as a whole, I think, has become, and especially as we have a lot of, boomer generation businesses being transitioned, they have invested so much time and resource and energy into building this company. It truly is treated like a child, and the people are the biggest part of that in most cases. And so, understanding how that is going to unfold as the transaction closes is a huge piece of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we'll kind of jump in just to a couple last slides here, just to kind of wrap things up before opening up for a few, questions at the end. But really just, kind of to summarize things and highlight, really just the kind of calendar that relates to the transaction, right? As we talked about before, we kind of started just with the whole M&A process, where it begins, how it kind of goes all the way through, and it gets to the end, right? So, kind of to Rob's point, what he's talking before, right? There's different key stages as we go through it, right? You have your kind of first, initial planning, where it's getting into the process, right? Understanding the business, how are you pulling together kind of the presentation to show that off, whether it's a teaser or other type of sim that's there, making sure the numbers are all aligned. And then from there, right, you move into that kind of marketing phase, phase one, phase two, right? Kind of depending on the approach you're taking to get through there. Is it more of that limited approach? You go more a broader range, or an auction where you're going to have a longer time through there and go solicit different types of bids and get to there. And that can kind of vary right from that timeline, just as Rob had mentioned before. And then ultimately I then start to get into kind of negotiation period, right? Get into that, whether it's the IOI piece to start, or maybe just going directly to the LOI and getting that more exclusivity with one buyer, and work towards getting that kind of approval and closing period. So, I guess, from Rob, he can kind of chime in maybe a little bit here too, is just, they like to kind of start from the endpoint and work backwards, right? Here's kind of where we want to end up and how do we get there, right? What are the key processes, parts, what are the timelines we want to hit? And I think having a calendar like this, or having a checklist that's out there is really helpful too. Because not only does it keep you kind of on track from there and help a buyer understand, or a seller understand how long this can take, but also identifies, where are the key areas we're going to have to involve other advisors, right? Where do we want to make sure that we have everything starting on the legal side? Where are you going to get maybe more of that HR kind of diligence to that point of, making sure the employees and everything are kept in trend there. So I think it's just a helpful tool to have that that you know, keeps everyone on track and expectations out there as well.
Yeah, I think you're right, man. I think the key is really just managing expectations and you know, helping sellers understand more than anything. This is not necessarily going to be the easiest process that you've ever undertaken, but you know, we as advisors are here to help you through each of these phases and try and take as much of the burden off of you as we can, so that we can make sure that as we get into the later stages, you're still fresh and still engaged and still feel confident and ready to make that sale.
Definitely. So then, yeah, that's kind of the overall transaction. But you know, one other area we wanted to talk on just a little bit was post transaction, right? So you know, we get all the way through, and that deal closes, and everything's all good and great, but that's not the end of it, right? There's usually a post closing true up that's going to come through, and I think this is you know, over the last kind of year, a couple of years even, that we've seen this has become more of I don't know if I'd say contentious always, but can be a lot of issues and things that resolve there, just for going back to, right, how net working capital was initially negotiated, how some of the terms are defined in the agreement, you know, that can cause pain points. So we really want to open up just for questions here, you know, on this end, you know, in deals that you've been working on, or any examples of, you know, what kind of pain points have you ran into, whether it's leading right up to closing and it's a last minute change, or if there's stuff that has come out, you know, post closing where there's a big dispute on a true up. But just curious whether anyone here has run into any issues or pain points on that end.
And I think also, in light of that, we're approaching the top of the hour. You know, if there's any other questions at this point, we open up and would love to have just kind of an open dialogue on anything that you know, whether in regards to this presentation or just transactions as a whole. Would love to have a conversation. I guess one question I would be curious for some of the legal minds in the room. Do you guys feel like in the current deal environment, with it really being a seller's market, have you seen a noticeable shift in terms that are more seller advantageous or benefit the seller, whether it's in kind of call it earn out clauses or anything like that, or has it stayed pretty kind of steady state with where it was maybe 5 years ago when the market wasn't quite what it was today? See, there's a question in the queue as well. Have you seen insurance policies on the true up being effective to negotiate and resolve post close? Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, or I can.
Yeah, you know, I guess we haven't ran into that too often yet on that end. I guess kind of, you know, luckily from that side, we haven't had too many horror stories with stuff that's come through. But I think it can be, you know, an effective tool in some instances, right? I think, you know, what's the best way to give and take, right? To make things less of a dispute. I mean, I don't think that's what anyone wants to get to in the end, but making sure it's fair there. And I don't know, maybe Rob or Kyle too, if you guys have any.
Yeah, I have seen it. I would say I've seen it more recently, which I think is indicative probably just of what Matt said, which is that working capital is getting more focus, more attention, whereas previously maybe it was less of a, you know, a deal negotiation point. I think people are paying more attention to it. I would say, you know, other common things that we've seen that have been used probably more effectively than insurance policy is putting collars around working cap targets, so that basically we say, hey, look, if it's plus or minus X number, you know, if we have a $5 million peg, if it's plus or minus $200,000, this isn't about being a cash grab. It's about closing the deal and making sure people are generally made whole and you have sufficient working capital to continue the business. And so let's just put a collar around it so that it, you know, we're not nickel and diming. I think the other thing that we've seen, you know, is just having a lot more clarity on the front end. Kyle mentioned this, but it's been said a couple of times throughout the, you know, the presentation, having very, very specific definitions for working capital, and doing a lot of, you know, work on the front end to make sure that the target is appropriate and that we know how things are being calculated and defined, leads us to less disputes, generally speaking. Not to say they can't happen, but we've seen that to be probably the most effective way to avoid issues.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then on kind of the general kind of reps and warranties insurance, I think that the insurance carriers are getting smarter all the time. You know, their diligence list and questions list is getting more exhaustive. They exclude the littlest things if it wasn't covered, even though it should be a very minimal exposure area. So they're just doing a lot more work to mitigate. So I think it is effective, because otherwise they wouldn't be going through that type of effort. You know, whether that continues or not, I would expect it would, I guess.
Up in warranties insurance, just one, not full horror story, but mini horror story maybe. Recently we had a transaction where basically the underwriting on the insurance was so difficult, to Kyle's point, that the parties scrapped rep and warranty insurance, which had been contemplated from the LOI stage. And we ended up having to scrap it and negotiate at the 11th hour, renegotiate the whole deal without rep and warranty insurance, because getting it underwritten just wasn't going to happen. It would have happened eventually, but it wouldn't have happened in a timely manner. So something to watch out for if you're going to do that, is the underwriting's been pretty tough.
Yeah, that is a valid point. And interestingly enough, I would say, you know, the financial diligence people have gotten really good and a lot more efficient in doing their processes as you know, part of diligence. The insurance people, I think, are still catching up on those efficiencies. So the amount of you know, burden and the amount of information pulled is probably similar between the two groups. But to your point, the time that's taken on the insurance side of things, I feel like has been really, really difficult for us in the last couple of deals, you know, taking upwards of like 2+ months versus the financial diligence, which is, you know, 3 to 5 weeks at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point.
Any other questions? Anybody want to throw something in the chat that's on their mind? Otherwise, we can move to adjourn.
Yeah, I think even to add to that, if there is anything else there, since we're at the top of the hour, you know, feel free to reach out to Rob, myself, or even Kyle there. You know, we're happy to answer any questions or connect further on things, and you know, here to ultimately help. Right, we're all working in the same boat on transactions and helping them close. So I think hopefully everything here was helpful today, and we appreciate everyone, you know, taking the time to stop in and listen. It was a good conversation.
Yeah, without a doubt, appreciate that from everybody. And the recording of this, I'm being told, will be shared with you guys along with the presentation. You know, so to the extent that you guys have additional questions or want to review those materials, they'll be made available to you guys all in the next, I think, 24 to 48 hours. So look forward to that. And again, by all means, reach out. Would love to have a conversation about what you guys are seeing in the marketplace and how we can help each other out. Awesome. Everybody have a great day, and we will see you all next time.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, everyone.